There were 710 people standing on the deck of the Titanic who watched it sink and lived. 710 witnesses. And to this day, almost nobody can agree on what they actually saw. Stop for a second and think about that. You've heard this story your whole life. The band playing as the ship went down. The women and children first. The iceberg slicing through steel like it was nothing. You've seen the movie, maybe more than once. You think you know how this ends. But here's the thing I need you to sit with for a moment. What if almost everything you've been told about that night isn't quite the whole truth? What if the band didn't play Nearer My God to Thee as its final song, and we only believe that because of a story told decades later by a man who wasn't even sure himself? What if the iceberg wasn't even the real killer? What if the ship that could have saved hundreds of lives was sitting close enough to see the distress flares and did nothing? I want you to picture it. April 14th, 1912. 11:40 p.m. The North Atlantic is flat as glass, no moon, stars so sharp they look painted on, and somewhere in third class a woman is tucking her children into a narrow bunk, telling them everything is fine because that's what mothers do at sea. She has no idea she has about 2 hours left. That's the story tonight. Not the version with the movie soundtrack playing underneath it, the real one. The one with the contradictions, the cover-ups, the small decisions made by ordinary men that decided who would live and who would freeze in waters so cold it stopped hearts in minutes. Because that's what this story has always really been about. Not a ship, not an iceberg. People, the choices they made when there was no time left to think, and what those choices still tell us all these years later about who we are when everything we trusted starts going under. Stay with me. This is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. Let's go back to where it really started, not the iceberg, before that. The Titanic wasn't built to be safe. Understand that first, because it changes everything else you're about to hear. It was built to be believed, built to make people stop asking questions about whether something this big should even float. The White Star Line was losing a race, not a race of speed, a race of size. Their rival Cunard had just launched 2 ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, faster than anything else on the water. White Star couldn't win that fight, so they decided to win a different one. If they couldn't be the fastest, they'd be the grandest, the most luxurious, the most unsinkable. And that word, unsinkable, is where I want you to slow down with me for a moment. Because nobody at White Star Line ever officially called the Titanic unsinkable. Not in writing, not in their advertisements. What they said was that it was designed with watertight compartments, that it could stay afloat even with several of them flooded. A reasonable technical claim. But people don't repeat technical claims at dinner tables, they repeat stories. And the story that spread through newspapers, through word of mouth, through sheer human hope, was simpler and far more seductive. This ship cannot sink. Think about how that happens in your own life. How a careful hedge statement turns into an absolute truth by the time it's passed from person to person. How this should be fine becomes this is fine. We do this with people, with plans, with our own health sometimes. We take a probability and we turn it into a promise because the promise feels so much better to carry around. 16 watertight compartments, doors that could seal shut at the push of a button controlled from the bridge. On paper, brilliant. In the press, magic. And here's the part that still unsettles me every time I think about it. The compartments didn't go all the way up. They were tall enough to hold back water in a typical collision. Nobody designed for a 600-foot gash along the side, opening compartment after compartment like dominoes. They built a ship to survive the disasters they could imagine. The ocean, as it turned out, had a different imagination entirely, and maybe that's the first quiet truth hiding inside this story. We don't usually get hurt by the threat we prepared for. We get hurt by the one nobody thought to mention in the meeting. The Titanic left Southampton on April 10th, 1912, carrying over 2,200 people, crew, immigrants chasing a new life in America, and some of the wealthiest people on Earth, all sharing the same dark water beneath their feet, even if they'd never share a deck. First-class passengers walked beneath crystal chandeliers, dined on fresh oysters, swam in a heated pool. Third-class passengers, many of them Irish, Lebanese, Scandinavian, slept in narrow berths near the noisy engines, carrying everything they owned in a single trunk. Among them was a young woman named Margaret, traveling alone, planning to meet her brother in Chicago. She'd sold nearly everything to afford this passage. To her, the ship wasn't luxury, it was a door to a different life. She had no way of knowing the door was about to close in the middle of the Atlantic, 4 days from now, at 20 minutes to midnight. We always talk about the Titanic's grandeur, the grand staircase, the orchestra. But maybe the real story isn't the ship at all. Maybe it's the thousands of small, ordinary hopes that were sailing inside it, and how quickly hope and catastrophe can occupy the exact same hour. Now let's talk about the warnings, because this is where the story stops being about fate and starts being about people. That day, April 14th, the Titanic received not one, not two, but at least 6 separate ice warnings from other ships in the area. 6. Some came through official channels and were posted on the bridge. Others arrived informally, almost casually, the way you might mention traffic to a friend on the phone. One came from the steamship Caronia, warning of icebergs directly in the Titanic's path. Another from the Baltic, then the America. Then, just hours before the collision, a ship called the Mesaba sent a message describing a massive ice field, heavy pack ice and numerous large icebergs, stretched directly across the Titanic's course. That message never reached the bridge, not because someone ignored it out of recklessness. Because the wireless operator, a young man named Jack Phillips, was buried under a backlog of passenger telegrams, rich travelers sending word ahead to New York about dinner reservations and stock prices, and the ice warning got set aside, waiting its turn like a piece of mail under a pile of more urgent-looking mail. Sit with that for a second. The thing that could have saved 1,500 lives lost a competition for attention against messages about dinner plans. How many times in your own life has the truly important thing gotten quietly buried under the merely urgent? The phone call you meant to make, the conversation you kept postponing because something louder was demanding the room first. We don't usually fail because we don't care. We fail because the wrong thing got our attention first, and by the time we noticed, the moment had already moved on without us. Then there's the most haunting warning of all, the one from a ship called the Californian, sitting still in the water that very night, less than 20 miles away. The Californian's wireless operator, a man named Cyril Evans, tried to warn the Titanic about the ice directly. He radioed over a message, and Jack Phillips, exhausted, overworked, and irritated by the interruption, sent back a sharp reply. Shut up, I am busy." Evans, stung by the response, simply turned off his wireless set for the night and went to bed. Just sit in that moment with me. A tired man's irritation, another man's wounded pride turning off a radio. 2 small, completely human reactions, nothing dramatic, nothing villainous, just 2 exhausted people being exactly as flawed as the rest of us. And somewhere in between those 2 reactions, the last real chance at an early warning quietly closed. This is the part of the Titanic story that movies rarely capture because it isn't cinematic. There's no storm, no monster, no single evil decision. There's just fatigue, pride, distraction. The most human failures imaginable, stacking on top of each other, one small thing at a time until they built something none of those individual men ever intended. A silence at exactly the moment silence could kill. By 11 p.m., the temperature on deck had dropped low enough that the lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were rubbing their hands together in the crow's nest, eyes straining against a flat, moonless dark. No binoculars. There'd been a mix-up earlier in the voyage, and the ones meant for the lookouts had gone missing, locked away with a key nobody could find. No binoculars, no moon, no warning relayed. Just two cold men squinting into the black when something darker than the night itself rose silently out of the water dead ahead. 11:40 p.m. Frederick Fleet sees it first, a shape, darker than the water around it, rising where there should be nothing but open ocean. He rings the bell 3 times, the signal for danger dead ahead. Then he picks up the phone to the bridge and says 4 words that would be repeated for the next 100 years. Iceberg, right ahead. What happens next takes less than 40 seconds. First Officer Murdoch orders the ship turned hard to port, engines reversed, and here's something most people never learn. That order, the one that seemed like the obvious right call, may have actually made things worse. If the Titanic had struck the iceberg head-on, bow first, the damage would have been horrific, but likely contained to the front compartments. The ship probably would have survived. Instead, the turn caused the iceberg to scrape along the side of the hull for nearly 10 seconds, opening a series of narrow gashes across 6 separate compartments. Not one devastating wound, 6 small ones, spread out exactly where the ship was most vulnerable. The decision that felt like survival instinct may have been the very thing that sealed the ship's fate. I think about that more than almost anything else in this story. How the instinct to avoid disaster head-on sometimes opens the door to something slower and worse. We do this too, don't we? We swerve to avoid one kind of pain, and the swerve itself creates a different wound, one that takes longer to notice but goes deeper. Most passengers felt almost nothing, a faint shudder, a scraping sound like a long fingernail dragged along the hull. Some woke up, many didn't. In third class, near the bow where the impact was most severe, a few people actually saw ice spill into their cabins, chunks of it, knocked loose from the berg, scattered across the floor like a strange cold gift nobody wanted. For nearly an hour, almost no one understood what had actually happened. Stewards walked the halls, reassuring passengers it was nothing, just a precaution, just a routine stop. Card games continued in the smoking room. Someone reportedly kicked a piece of ice across the deck for fun, like a child playing with a toy that had fallen from the sky. That's the part that gets me every time. The gap between what was actually happening below the waterline, water rushing in at the rate of roughly 7 tons a second, and what people upstairs believed was happening, which was nothing at all. Captain Edward Smith, a veteran with over 40 years at sea, went below with the ship's builder, Thomas Andrews, the man who had designed the Titanic with his own hands. Andrews did the math standing in the mailroom, watching water climb where it had no business being. And he delivered a verdict that the captain had to carry back up into a ship full of people still laughing, still playing cards, still certain they were safe. The ship had 1 hour, maybe 2. Imagine being the one who has to walk back into that room, the warm one full of orchestra music and champagne, knowing what you now know and having to decide in that very moment how much of the truth to tell and how fast. That decision, how much truth, how fast, is about to determine who lives and who doesn't. Captain Smith gave the order at 12:05 a.m., uncover the lifeboats. And almost immediately a problem revealed itself, one that had nothing to do with ice and everything to do with arithmetic nobody wanted to face out loud. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. Combined capacity, just over 1,100 people. There were more than 2,200 souls on board. Let that sit for a moment. The ship had enough lifeboats for roughly half the people standing on its deck. Not because the law required more. By the regulations of 1912, the Titanic actually exceeded the minimum lifeboat requirement. The law itself was the failure, written for a different era of smaller ships, never updated as vessels grew larger and larger. The Titanic followed every rule, and the rules were already wrong before the ship ever left the dock. We like to believe disasters happen because someone broke a rule. The harder truth, the one this story keeps insisting on, is that sometimes the rule itself is the danger. Everyone can follow the procedure perfectly and still walk straight into catastrophe because nobody updated the procedure to match the size of what they'd built. Now picture the deck at midnight, confusion everywhere. No one had ever drilled an actual evacuation. A lifeboat drill scheduled for that very Sunday had been quietly canceled for reasons no one ever fully explained. So when the moment came, crew members were learning the lifeboat's mechanisms in real time, in the dark, in the cold, while passengers stood in their night clothes, still half convinced this was an overreaction. The first lifeboat lowered, boat number 7, left the ship carrying only 28 people. Its capacity was 65. Read that again. 28 people in a boat built for 65, lowered into the freezing Atlantic while the deck behind them was still crowded with passengers who hadn't been told the truth. Why would anyone do that? Because almost nobody on that deck, crew or passenger, could truly believe the unsinkable ship was actually sinking. People hesitated to step into small wooden boats, dangling 70 feet above black water, when the alternative was standing on a massive, brightly lit orchestra-playing vessel that felt infinitely safer. Several women initially refused to leave their husbands. A few passengers actually climbed out of lifeboats and returned to the ship, choosing the appearance of safety over the reality of it. This is one of the most human moments in the entire disaster, and one of the least discussed. We don't always run from danger. Sometimes we stand very still inside it, because the danger hasn't announced itself loudly enough yet, and the room we're standing in still feels like the safest place on Earth, right up until it isn't. Women and children first, the phrase you've heard your whole life, wasn't a strict rule. It was Officer William Murdoch's interpretation on one side of the ship, and a far stricter, more literal one from Officer Lightoller on the other. Lightoller turned away men entirely, even when boats had empty seats. Murdoch, on the opposite side, allowed men aboard when no women were nearby waiting. Same ship, same hour, two different men, two entirely different definitions of who got to live. That single detail might be the truest thing this story has to tell you. Survival that night didn't come down to one unified noble policy. It came down to which side of the deck you happened to be standing on, and which officer happened to be standing closest to you. By 1 in the morning, the band was still playing. You've heard about this detail your whole life, the musicians who kept performing as the ship went down around them. What you may not know is who they really were. 8 men. Not heroes by training, not soldiers, not officers with some code of duty drilled into them. Just working musicians hired to provide a pleasant evening soundtrack for first-class dinners who made a choice nobody asked them to make. Wallace Hartley, the band leader, had reportedly told a friend before the voyage that if he were ever on a sinking ship, he'd play something calming, something that wouldn't add to the panic. Survivors disagree on exactly what they played in those final minutes. Some remember ragtime, lighter songs meant to keep spirits up. Others insist the final piece was a hymn we will never know for certain. The band went down with the ship, and the only witnesses left are decades-old memories shaped by grief and time into whatever felt true enough to hold on to. But here's what's not in dispute. They kept playing, not because it would save anyone. It wouldn't. They kept playing because, in a moment when nearly everything dignified about human behavior had cracked under the weight of pure terror, 8 men decided that the people around them deserved a few more minutes of something beautiful before the end. That wasn't bravery in the dramatic, cinematic sense. It was something quieter, a decision to be useful in the only way left available to them. I think that's worth sitting with longer than we usually do. We talk about heroism like it always looks like rescue, like pulling someone from fire. But sometimes heroism just looks like staying at your post, doing the small, ordinary thing you know how to do, for people who are frightened and have nothing else to hold on to. At 2:18 a.m., the lights finally failed. Survivors described the ship's stern lifting almost entirely out of the water, the enormous hull groaning, metal twisting under stress it was never designed to bear, the sound, by every account, unlike anything any of them had ever heard before or would ever hear again. Some compared it to a building collapsing. Others said it sounded almost alive, like something in genuine pain. The Titanic broke in two. The bow sank first, relatively cleanly. The stern, filled with trapped air, briefly stood almost vertical against the night sky before it, too, slipped beneath the surface. At 2:20 a.m., it was gone. What followed may be the most disturbing hour of this entire story, and it's the part almost nobody talks about. Over 1,500 people were now in the water, in temperatures around 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Survival time in water that cold is measured in minutes, not hours. And in nearly every lifeboat nearby, the screaming of those people was clearly audible. Most boats did not go back. Some survivors later said they feared being swamped by panicked swimmers if they returned. Others simply froze, unable to act, paralyzed by the scale of what was happening around them. Only one boat eventually turned back to search for survivors in that black water, and by the time it did, almost everyone it found was already gone. This is the part of the Titanic that the movie never quite shows you with this much weight. Not the sinking itself, the hour after. The hour where ordinary people in small wooden boats had to listen to other human beings dying within earshot, and had to decide, in real time, with no instructions, no training, no time to think it through, what kind of person they were going to be. Most of them will tell you, even decades later, that they still don't fully know the answer. Hey, if you've stayed with me this far into the story, I want to ask you for something. Hit subscribe and come back here with us every day. We dig into moments like this one, the real history, the parts most people never get told. And honestly, it means more than you probably realize when someone decides to stick around for the next one. And I'll be honest with you, stories like this one stay with me longer than most. Maybe it's because we all like to believe we'd know exactly what to do in a moment like that. Who we'd save, how brave we'd be. But the truth is, none of us really knows. Not until the water's actually rising. All right, let's go back to that night, because there's still one part left that most people never hear. Just under 20 miles away, the Californian sat motionless in the water the entire time the Titanic was sinking. Crew members on board the Californian later testified they saw white flashes in the distance. What we now know were the Titanic's distress rockets, fired desperately into the sky, 8 of them, the universal signal of a ship in trouble. The Californian's officers discussed the lights among themselves. They debated what the flashes might mean. Someone suggested waking the captain. Someone else suggested it could simply be a ship sending signals for some unrelated reason, fireworks perhaps, or a celebration. They went back to watching. Captain Stanley Lord, asleep in his cabin, was informed of the rockets but chose not to come up to the bridge himself. The ship's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, the same man who'd been told to shut up hours earlier, had already gone to bed, his radio switched off for the night. There was no one listening when the Titanic's increasingly desperate distress calls went out across the airwaves, calls that could have reached the Californian in seconds, had anyone simply been there to hear them. By the time the Californian's crew finally understood what they'd actually witnessed, it was already morning. The Titanic was gone. Over 1,500 people were gone with it. I don't think this detail belongs in the story to assign blame exactly, though history certainly has, and Captain Lord spent the rest of his life defending himself. I think it belongs in the story because of what it quietly reveals about all of us. How easy it is to see something strange, something that doesn't quite fit, and choose the explanation that lets us go back to sleep instead of the one that demands we get up and act. We do this on a smaller scale constantly. We notice something a little off, in our health, in a relationship, in a decision we're about to make, and some part of us reaches immediately for the explanation that requires nothing from us. Fireworks instead of a flare, nothing instead of something, tomorrow instead of right now. The rescue, when it finally came, arrived from a ship called the Carpathia, racing nearly 58 miles through ice fields in the dark at a speed considered reckless for the conditions, because its captain, Arthur Rostron, decided the risk of speed was worth it against the certainty of what would happen if he didn't take it. The Carpathia pulled just over 700 survivors from lifeboats scattered across miles of freezing ocean, the very last ones rescued more than 4 hours after the Titanic had already disappeared beneath the surface. 710 people, out of more than 2,200, lived to tell a story that the world has been trying to fully understand for over 100 years. Here's what stayed with me, long after I learned all the details you just heard. The Titanic didn't sink because of one mistake. It sank because of dozens of small, human, forgivable ones stacked quietly on top of each other. A warning set aside, a radio switched off, a turn instead of a head-on hit, a lifeboat lowered half-empty, a captain who chose sleep over certainty, not villains, not monsters, just people doing what tired, proud, hopeful, frightened people do on an ordinary night that turned out to be anything but. And maybe that's the part of this story that never really leaves you. We want disasters to have a single cause, a single person to point to, because that would mean we could simply avoid being that person and everything would be fine. But this story keeps insisting on something harder to sit with. That catastrophe rarely announces itself. It accumulates quietly in the space between things that each, on their own, seemed reasonable enough at the time. Margaret made it. The young woman traveling alone to meet her brother in Chicago, she found a seat in one of the last boats to leave, and she watched the ship she'd boarded with everything she owned disappear into black water 4 days after she'd first stepped onto its deck, full of hope about the life waiting for her on the other side of an ocean. She got that life. Not the one she imagined, on the ship she imagined it on, a different one. One she didn't know to be grateful for until the moment the alternative became unbearably real. I think about her more than I think about the captain, or the iceberg, or even the band still playing as the water rose. Because her story is the quiet one, the one without a single famous quote attached to it. Just a woman who got into a boat when she didn't fully understand why she should, and who spent the rest of her life carrying both the worst night she ever lived through and the fact that she got to live through it at all. That's where I want to leave you tonight. If this story found something in you, and I think it did, or you wouldn't still be here, do me a favor. Follow the channel, and if you can, send this to 5 people who'd sit with it the way you just did, and tell me, in the comments, honestly, which part of tonight's story is still sitting with you right now? And what should we go looking for next? I'll be here, same time, same place.